Only one story around, isn't there? So Keir Starmer under pressure tonight to strip the British citizenship of the anti-white racist Jew hater Alaa Abd El-Fattah, the activist he welcomed into Britain at the weekend.
8 p.m. across Britain, the reaction exploded. Within minutes, millions of users flooded social media. By early evening, tens of thousands had taken to the streets. From London to Birmingham, from Manchester to Leeds, crowds gathered fast. Riot barriers went up around Westminster. Police lines formed along Whitehall. Chants echoed through the heart of government: resign, deport, not in our name. By 8:35 p.m, this was no longer just online outrage, it was on the streets. By 9 p.m, it had reached Parliament's doors. What began as political pressure was rapidly turning into open confrontation. At the centre of it all was a decision the government had praised just days earlier, now pulling the Prime Minister into the most serious crisis of his leadership. December 27th, top priority, a decision publicly celebrated, no warning, no caution, no conditions attached. December 29th, information failure. The tone changed, the framing changed. In just 48 hours, a decision once described as a national priority was quietly reframed through a letter sent by Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, acknowledging it as an information failure at a system level, not through clear political accountability, but through a calculated move to steer public reaction, shifting attention away from the decision itself and toward how information was handled. But the problem is not Alaa Abd El-Fattah. The problem is a government that decides first and explains later, a system that acts quickly, checks slowly, and only reviews itself once public backlash has erupted. The public is never consulted beforehand, but always ends up paying the price afterward. This is not an isolated mistake. This is how the system operates. And what comes next shows that this system is beginning to fracture across justice, migration, and the economy. The prison releases exposed more than administrative failure. They revealed a policy built on haste and denial of risk. In the rush to relieve overcrowding, safeguards were treated as obstacles rather than necessities. Hundreds were released in error. Some had been sentenced only days earlier. Names like Brahim Kador Sheriff William Smith and Hadush Kabatu were not flagged before release but discovered afterward. Police were notified late. Communities were left exposed. This was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system that values throughput over control. It is outsourcing risk to the public. A government that loses track of who it frees has already lost authority over its own system. The same policy failure defines immigration controls, especially age verification. Claims were accepted first. Checks came later. In the Cooper Park case in Elgin Murray, a suspect who claimed to be 14 was later confirmed to be over 20. Verification happened only after a serious offence had already occurred. This was not a loophole exploited by chance. It was a system designed to trust declarations before evidence. When placement precedes verification, the state is not exercising compassion. It is abandoning duty. Policies that delay scrutiny until after harm has occurred do not protect the vulnerable. They manufacture risk, then pretend surprise when that risk materialises. Economic policy follows the same broken logic. The agricultural inheritance tax was set at £1 million, despite it clear warnings that land-rich, cash-poor farming families would be forced to sell simply to survive. The policy went ahead anyway. Only after protests erupted, only after public anger became impossible to contain, did the government retreat and raise the threshold to £2.5 million. This was not listening, it was damage and control. The pattern is undeniable. Policies are imposed without foresight, defended without understanding, reversed only under pressure. This is not economic leadership, it is governance by backlash, where the public is used as a stress test for policy failure. What these cases expose is not policy error, it is governing without control. Decisions are made before the system knows whether it can carry them safely. Prison releases happened before the state knew who was being released. Immigration placements happened before age and risk were properly verified. Tax policy was announced before the government understood who it would destroy. This is not complexity, it is blindness. A government that does not test its decisions before imposing them is not leading. It is gambling. Safeguards are treated as paperwork. Verification is postponed. Consequences are discovered in real time. That is not how a functioning state operates. Control must come before action, not after fallout. When ministers approve policies without ensuring the system beneath them can execute safely, responsibility does not disappear. It multiplies. This government is not overwhelmed by events. It is manufacturing them. A state that only sees damage after it happens has already lost control of governance. In every case, the same mechanism appears. Risk is pushed downward. The public becomes the shock absorber for bad policy. Communities absorb the danger of mistaken prison releases. Families absorb the cost of failed immigration checks. Farmers absorb the damage of reckless tax experiments. Ministers issue statements. Officials promise reviews, but harm does not pause while the system explains itself. Citizens are not consulted before decisions are imposed, yet they are expected to live with the aftermath. That is not public service. It is offloading failure. A government that repeatedly exposes its population to avoidable risk is no longer protecting society. It is using society as insulation. Trust cannot survive that arrangement. Stability cannot survive it. Accountability becomes meaningless when consequences are always borne by others. When the public is treated as a testing ground for policy mistakes, anger is not extremism. It is the predictable result of neglect. The lesson is not complicated. It is being ignored. Speed without control is not strength, it is weakness. Policies as announced before scrutiny are not decisive, they are irresponsible. A government that constantly explains itself after harm has occurred is not transparent. It is late. A system that only corrects itself under pressure does not govern, it reacts. This is how institutional failure becomes normal, not through collapse, but through repetition. Each crisis is framed as exceptional. Each reversal is sold as learning. But learning that only happens after damage is not learning. It is denial. The purpose of the state is to prevent harm, not to apologise for it. When explanation replaces prevention, government stops functioning as protection and starts functioning as damage control. That is the real crisis. Not one name, not one decision, but a governing model that no longer knows how to act responsibly before consequences arrive. Until that changes, the next failure is already inevitable. And the most dangerous part is not a single term in office, it is the precedent. When a government can act without preparation, reverse course without accountability, and continue as if nothing happened, the standard of governance is permanently lowered. Systems do not collapse from one shock. They decay through repeated bad decisions that are never properly paid for. A society remains safe only when power is restrained by discipline, and when those who make decisions bear the consequences before the public does. That is not ideology, it is basic governance. And when that principle is broken, every citizen has reason to speak out before the cost becomes irreversible. If you want to understand how institutional failure takes root, how it repeats under different headlines, and why it keeps returning, stay with the channel and subscribe for clear, independent analysis.